I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I'm your host for this podcast, and today it is my extraordinary honor to welcome Dr. Carolyne Larrington, Emerita Professor of Medieval European Literature at the University of Oxford. Dr. Larrington is also Emerita Research Fellow at St. John's College, and she is the author of several wonderful books, including most recently the Little Book of Fairies, but also the Norse myths that shape the way we think. And today I will be talking to Dr. Larrington about her entirely impressive body of research, scholarship, and hopefully this conversation is going to go in a variety of different directions. So, Dr. Larrington, welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast.
And it's great to be with you and to be able to talk to all your listeners here and viewers, indeed, since we are live on video.
Absolutely. And if we ever need to drop in some pictures, I can do that later. If there's something that you feel needs a visual, let me know, and I can always add some images. But for now, I would really love it if you could give our viewers kind of an overview of the research that you're doing now. And then, of course, we're going to delve into your areas of specialty, including Old Norse, the Viking Age, enchantresses, fairies, dragons, and all of that fun stuff.
Well, what I'm doing at the moment is I have a couple of projects on hand. One is an academic project, and one is writing a trade book. And actually, there's another one as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what I'm spending a lot of my time doing at the moment is getting started on a book on women and global myth. And this is something that I've been under contract to do for quite a while, but I have just not got round to getting a proper purchase on it, because you really need to be absorbed in the material and think about it. And you can't just pick it up for a week and then go off and do something else. So I've just been writing a chapter on women and creation, and now I'm moving on to women and love and sex, and probably marriage as well, but marriage might go into chapter 3, so I'm not quite sure about that. And what I want to do with this book is it partly riffs off the feminist companion to mythology, also published as the women's companion to mythology, that I worked on, more than 30 years ago now. And a couple of years back, I went to an exhibition at the British Museum in London called Feminine Power. And it was an interesting exhibition, but there were quite a lot of things that annoyed me about it. It wasn't terribly seriously presented. It was pretty eclectic. It had exhibits from Hawaii, from India, from Africa. It was really global in that respect. But somehow the captions were just a little bit kind of facile. And it also invited you to enter the exhibition by identifying with 5 women who were introducing it. And one of them was Professor Mary Beard,
Okay.
who obviously had sensible things to say about the kind of classical stuff. But another one was a human rights lawyer, and another one was a stand-up comedian, and another one was a kind of wellness author. None of whom had anything at all useful to say, it seemed to me. And so I wrote a review for the Times Literary Supplement in which I complained a bit about this. And I thought, actually, somebody needs to write a better book about women in global myth. And it needs to be not just a retread of women in Greek myth, women in ancient Near Eastern myth, which is also kind of familiar these days, or women in Norse myth, women in Celtic myth, but it needs to be something that looks kind of more broadly across the world. But of course, there's such a huge range of material. You've got to pick and choose and try to pull themes out of the different collections of stories that you can now find on the internet, actually.
Right.
These collections of folk tales and myths that people put together 100 years ago,
Well, and
which
in
is
that,
still,
yeah,
yeah, really
and they're still
useful.
viable, but you've got to be able to sort through what is credible, what actually has source material to back it up, and what is just modern fantasy or, shall we say, wishful thinking.
Yeah, but what you do find on something like Project Gutenberg or the Internet Archive is these uploaded versions of books which have been very often collected by anthropologists or by people who've been living among communities in Africa and South America for decades, who speak the native language and who've collected these stories together, maybe not with a huge amount of kind of um, an analytic approach, but it also means they don't mess about with them so much. I
Right.
think they just kind of write down what this guy told them.
As a
And oh,
yes,
I
see, here we
just
said
seen the arrival of a cat.
this is Belladonna. This is the big one. So this is Belladonna. She's rather large. Hellebore will be the orange one who will come up and try and vie for space.
Right,
Ow.
I can see. Yes, closing in there.
She is indeed. But well, I think that's a very interesting approach because of all of these texts that exist that are uploaded to the internet. And I've read some of them about African stories that were collected in the 1930s. And of course, in those cases, they were white missionaries who kind of had
Mm.
a not so much pejorative, but not also not the most, shall we say, comprehensive understanding of the culture. They were like, oh, isn't this an interesting story? And they were coming at it from that missionary framework. Now, the ones you're talking about with people who live within a culture and who study the language and understand the cultural traditions, as you say, they're not commenting; they're simply recording. Is that more what you mean? And in terms of those mythologies?
Yeah, yeah. And quite often the framing is, oh, look at these primitive people and their beliefs in a way. But if you step around that, you can still pull out a great deal of really interesting thinking. And in part, it's a way of getting at, well, I don't really want to say universal ideas about women, though clearly we have got some ideas which just span the planet in terms of who is it who gives birth to children, for example, who is it who is physically the weaker sex, who is it who in a large number of cultures must be obtained from the parents as a wife.
Right. Well,
And
it's
yeah, how much you have to pay for that and that kind of thing, and how you value women in your culture. So there's a lot of kind of quite universal principles. Interestingly, connection between women and death, which keeps coming up. Not that women go around killing their husbands, of course, but that death is very often in Western culture. We think of death as male wandering around with his scythe and chopping people down, but in many cultures, death is female, and who the person who rules over the kingdom of the dead is female, and there may be something that's kind of comforting about that, that it's your mother who brings you into the world, and it's a kind of mother who's there to take you out again. So there's that kind of general principle that's interesting, but then there's also very specific stuff from culture to culture. Do you value a woman who's good at grinding millet?
right.
Or do you want one who can sew a decent pair of sealskin boots? These things all depend, obviously, on what it is that's primary in the roles that women play in a particular culture.
Yeah,
So
when
that's what I've been embarking on in the last couple of months.
Oh, that sounds like a fascinating. You're right. I can see where that's not something that you can just do it in little tiny snippets. You need to kind of sit down and immerse yourself in it. And it's interesting because when I was in an undergrad and I worked in women and gender studies, one of the things that we first learned was the Western tunnel vision, the tendency to assume that, well, women's issues must be X, Y, and Z based on our
Mm.
Western perspective of what a woman's issue is. Whereas, as you say, in some cultures, a woman's issue is getting water. A woman's issue is having access to the resources necessary to provide for her family in a way that Western culture often doesn't think about it. So are you finding those intersections and kind of intertextual motifs in the mythology as well?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting stories. There's an African one I came across just the other day where a man he only has 100 head of cattle, and he has fallen in love with, or he really, really wants to marry the most beautiful woman in the village. And he says to her father, "What will you take for her?" And he says, 100 head of cattle. And he goes, "Okay." And so he hands over the cattle, they get married. She comes back to his home and says, "Well, where is the milk? Where is the meat?" And he says, well, we don't have anything to
Anything.
live on because I spent it all on you. And she goes out, she borrows some milk and some meat, and she sends him out to work, and he has to get stuff from the neighboring farm and so on. But eventually, her father comes, so she invites her father over, and there's also a man who's very interested in the wife, and he wants to sleep with her. And she says, "Well, maybe, maybe not. But if you let's talk about it, give me a sheep, and then we'll speak." And so she prepares the sheep for a feast, invites her father over. And the adulterer comes around thinking, "Oh, this is my moment," and finds that he's in the middle of this sheep feast. So he has to sit down and eat the sheep as well. And her husband's saying, "Where did the sheep come from?" And her father is saying, "Well, you seem to be living okay." And the adulterer is going, "What's going on?" And then she says, "Okay, um, everybody here has not understood the value of things. You, the adulterer, thought you could buy me for a sheep." And the adulterer is so embarrassed he runs away. And she says, "You, my husband, thought I was worth 100 cows and you impoverished yourself. But that was too much to pay, even for me, because you weren't thinking ahead. Father, you overpriced me in some ways because I didn't have the skills to make a household for this man with no resources. So, Father, you need to sort this out." And the father says, "Fine, daughter, you come home with me. Your husband can come home as well, and we'll take care of you." And so there's a kind of women's wisdom there, playing everybody off and not chiding everybody, not getting rid of the husband because he wasn't practical, not putting the father on the spot, kicking the adulterer out, but scoring at least one sheep out of it and a decent dinner. And so I thought this story was really interesting in the way that this woman managed these three different sets of men without compromising herself and without losing too much, making sure they didn't lose too much face. And so everybody ends up living happily ever after. And she's back in her father's house, but with a husband, but not having to spend so much time trying to scrape together
A
what they
living,
need
right.
to live
It's the
on.
practical knowledge that, of course, the men who were so concerned with the commodity that they considered the woman to be, that they actually end up doing themselves and her a disservice. And I'm kind of intrigued because that reminds me of several of the women in the Norse sagas and in terms
Yeah.
of their practicality. And so obviously part of the question is, are you able to draw on your background of looking at women in Norse tradition, in Old English tradition, in the medieval traditions for this project as well?
I'm obviously thinking about the ways that women's lives are structured in pre-industrial society, which is what we're mostly talking about here. But what I'm aiming to do with this book is to not foreground too much the European
Right.
material.
Yes.
To mention it in passing, if you like, say, "Oh, look, isn't this like the story of Demeter and Persephone?" Or you also find in Old Norse that Freya has a
Yes.
chariot drawn by cats, or something like that. But not particularly to use. At least I'm trying to avoid using that sort of European grid
Right.
to say this is what these myths should look like. And here's a lot of weird, deviant stuff.
Right.
When, if you're immersed in that culture, this is your way of thinking about your world and how it came into existence. And you may understand that this is not literally how it all happened, but it's the story that you tell yourself.
Right. Well, I know that one of the things I have to explain to my students, even in composition, is that when we talk about the Middle Ages, there was a whole world, not just Europe, is that the world actually still existed in that 1,000 year period, and that there are advanced civilizations in Ethiopia and, of course, India and China and Japan that often get ignored in our discussions of Western medieval European studies. I mean, this is
Mm.
and so it is interesting to me that, of course, you're going to decentralize the European narrative for this project because you have done extensive work on the position of women in a lot of these medieval societies. I mean, one of my favorite is the King Arthur's Enchantresses. I love this one. So in the current work you're doing, even in decentralizing that European narrative, um, part of what at least I've gotten from your body of work, and I have a pile for my viewers, there will be a list on YouTube, I promise. But a lot of what you do is kind of dispel modern misconceptions about both the past, but also our perception of the past. And you do a lot of work in popular culture as well. Do you find, of course, in things like King Arthur's Enchantresses, one of the things I love about it is that discussion of these women in the actual text that they appear, not just the way that modern audiences perceive them. But you do a lot of work on different religious traditions that are not Christian, but were not erased by Christianity, and that intersection of belief and mythology. Is that also part of this process? And the project you're working on now is the different religious interpretations of those stories, which, one man's
Not,
myth is another man's religion.
yeah, I'm trying to sort of downplay the religious aspects in some ways, partly because I just don't know enough about
Mhm.
the religions of kind of shamanic tribes in northeast Siberia, or because I'm not an anthropologist in any
Right.
sense. And if I were an anthropologist, I'd have more sense anyway than to start trying to do anthropology on groups about which I didn't know anything at all. So what I'm really interested in this book is the pattern of stories. It's what kind of stories are told. How might we interpret the stories? And what, insofar as we can tell, what the original culture that told those stories might have made of it. But it's very hard to get any native informant for any, say, the kind of stuff that you find in Levi Strauss's accounts of Southern Native American views, that they're not stepping back from their stories and going, so you see what this is really about is fertility.
Right.
So you're always, if you're going to do that kind of thing, you're having to take it from the structure of the story itself, or you're looking at scholars who have looked into it. So what I'm my primary interest here is the patterns of story and what they might suggest to us. And that's, I think that is a kind of red thread that's run through a lot of my work, that I'm particularly in books like the Norse myths that shape the way we think, and also the work I did on Game of Thrones. What is it about medieval cultures? What is it about the Norse myths that that triggers imaginative work in the present? Why is
Right.
it that so much fantasy is medievalist fantasy? And
Right.
that's in fact the other main project that I'm working on at the moment is a book on a collection of essays with a colleague from Germany on epic fantasy franchises, medievalist
Okay.
ones, Middle Earth, Westeros and Essos, the world of George R. R. Martin, the world of The Witcher, but also the Arthurian story world, the Nibelungenlied story world is also coming into this, as is How to Train Your Dragon, in fact, which is a story world of its own as
Oh,
well.
yes.
And looking at the way that when you have a huge franchise like that and you need to keep growing it because you have a fan base and
Right.
you have a commercial imperative, how do you do it?
And how do you do it in a way that doesn't wear it out to the point where you stretch it beyond? the
Mm.
original storyline, but also beyond interest, where it just gets too involved. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the first three Game of Thrones books. I mean, I read them all, but the first
Uh-huh.
three are literary crack. But once you get into the unwieldiness of Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, where clearly it was a book that was split in half and there seems to be no continuity in certain plot lines, it does get overwhelming. And of course, once the
Mm.
series ended, I mean, honestly, once we got past Cersei's Walk of Shame at the end of season 5 in Game of Thrones, I don't know where it went. I saw it, but I saw that series and went, I have no idea what the fuck. Yes, it was one of those moments. And when she blows up King's Landing, I'm like, I wanted her tried for treason. I wanted the treason and
Yeah.
adultery angle because I think it just kind of goes off the rails. And so I have to say, I haven't seen the House of Dragons because it's like, well, I know how that all is ultimately going to run out, but lots of people love it. I was just at Awesome Con in DC, which is basically our version of Dragon Con and Comic
Uh-huh.
Con, and had a lovely chat with Sylvester McCoy, who was Radagast in The Hobbit. And that fandom is still there; it still exists. People still want more of it, but then invariably, when it's produced, people have a tendency to go, "Well, that's not as good." So how do
Yeah.
you grapple with that?
Well, and one of the most interesting questions that our collective is working on this is asking themselves is how do you generate new material? Where are you going to get it from? And one of the kind of truisms about Game of Thrones, I think, was that George R. R. Martin gave them bullet points. No, he gave them extensive notes for season 6,
Right,
and then some kind of random bullet points for season 7 and 8. So no wonder the narrative just kind of fell apart. And what's happened with House of the Dragon is you've got a source text in Fire and Blood, and that has kind of worked because it gives you an outline, but it doesn't fill in, it doesn't give you the conversations about politics. It doesn't give you all that much because it's designed to be a chronicle telling you the stuff that happened.
right.
Um, and it's not as richly imagined as the Game of Thrones books are. And so there are some ways in which the kind of simplification and pruning down of the storylines in House of the Dragons hasn't worked quite as well. George R. R. Martin himself has got into a big fight with the showrunner and is saying, yeah, this is not what I wanted at all. And you can kind of see that some of the storytelling problems that you had with Game of Thrones, which was you had and in the books as well, you have a really interesting plot line. What's happening in King's Landing with Cersei? What's happening to Daenerys in Meereen? And then they start wandering. The story follows people wandering randomly around Westeros or wandering around
Right,
Essos. And you think this is so uninteresting. Can we just go back to the main storyline now? Oh, here we are for a few chapters. Then whoa, off we go again. And this
right.
is what has happened in the second season of House of the Dragon. You've got some great politics going on in King's Landing, in Dragonstone. Meanwhile, Daemon Targaryen is in Harrenhal having a weird experience, lots of weird experiences, trying to build support from the people in the Riverlands,
Right.
but also random kind of supernatural seeresses turn
Things
up
happen.
and give him these visions, and the fan base is just going, "What? Why are we? Can we just go back and get some action?" And it's not even, "Can we see some more dragons fighting?" It's, "Can we have those kinds of political conversations about how you rule a medieval kingdom that was so interesting in Game of Thrones?"
Like an actual
Uh,
plot line would be amazing at that point.
Yeah, well, exactly. Knight of the Seven Kingdoms has worked really well because it really sticks to Martin's material, even
Okay.
down to the dialogue. It's got what, about 8 or 9 key characters. The episodes are quite short. It's all happening in the same place. There's no jumping around from storyline to storyline. And there's some kind of moves forward. This is here's a prophecy about what's going to happen. Um, but that's much simpler and is working much better. And you have, a similar problem with Rings of Power, if you like, that
Yeah,
you have a very well imagined Middle Earth. And what people are thinking about here is really Peter Jackson's Middle Earth, not so much
right,
Tolkien's Middle Earth.
right.
And then you've got Rings of Power with a very scanty amount of material that
That's
the
kind of
showrunners
loosely off the
use.
Silmarillion, is it not?
Yeah, yeah. But again, kind of a little bit like Fire and Blood. The Silmarillion hasn't got the dialogue, it hasn't got the characterization, it hasn't got the motivations. It's got this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
Well, I mean, that's Tolkien's variation on the Bible. That was meant to be kind of his backstory origins when he did the Silmarillion, and he never really intended it to be published, is my understanding. That the Silmarillion
Yeah.
was an evolving thing constantly throughout his life, and that was kind of his backstory, his Bible for the origin of all of the people of Middle Earth. And so, if you try to capture that, it's not ever going to be the way it is with the story with an actual plot line.
Yeah, and how you make more story is really the kind of key to what this book is about in some ways. So the War of the Rohirrim, for example, is does work pretty well, and it's
I bet it would, yeah.
got a kind of good um, connection across into Peter Jackson's world as well. It has this similar kind of aesthetics, let's say, and recognizable characters, even though it's set some hundred or so more years in the past. So that kind of question of story worlds and how you build a story world, a medieval story world that looks credible,
Right.
is one that I find really interesting, I think. And do you have dragons? Do you not have dragons? It's not so much that question of the historical versus the fantastic, so much as what does the fantasy audience that you're trying to attract, what are they looking for? What's going to pull them in?
What is their expectation? Because, I mean, even when you think about people who analyze something like Beowulf, and I would love it if they could make a good movie of Beowulf. And Beowulf and Grendel, to my mind, isn't terrible. 13th Warrior, I think, is exceptional. That's me.
Mm.
But the
Hmm.
animated one, the idea that they needed to explain the dragon, because for the Beowulf audience, they didn't need to explain the dragon. Dragons just were. They don't need some kind of backstory of an illicit relationship between said succubus, because I think part of that, and this is a question that I think you're probably better placed to answer, is the desire to say, well, we need an explanation for everything. But medieval
Mm.
audiences didn't necessarily need an explanation for everything. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is. Or at least that you have an imaginary which is quite capacious. And Beowulf is a kind of case in point, isn't it? That there's a lot that maybe an Anglo-Saxon audience knew. And so when you have little throwaway lines like King Hrothgar saying, "Oh yeah, I knew Beowulf's father. Yeah, he was here. He had a problem. He was in this feud with the Wolfings. I sorted it out."
Yeah.
And
And
you
he's here
think,
to pay a
well,
debt. Yeah.
yeah, I would kind of like to know more about that. But yeah, never mind. Maybe everybody who's listening to this poem in the mead hall or in the monastery, they're all going, "Oh yeah, yeah, of course that's that story," which we
Right.
don't.
Well, I mean
Um,
it, and it's like
yeah.
the early analysis of Beowulf tried to see it as a historical document in the early 20th century, and that's why Tolkien does his Monsters and the Critics, because he's basically saying, no, it's art, it's poetry. Let's enjoy the monsters and the fights with the monsters. But the reality of something like Beowulf is it's somewhere in between, because yeah, there are real historical details in the poem, but then there's also a dragon.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's one of the things I always used to say to my students was that people in Anglo-Saxon England or people in the Norse world, they had never seen a dragon, obviously, but you might know someone who knew a man whose uncle had seen a dragon, and you'd also never seen an elephant, but people had also knew somebody who knew somebody who knew someone who'd been to the Mediterranean and had seen somewhere an elephant.
Right.
And well, who's to say that elephants exist but dragons don't?
Right. I mean, and
Both of
just
them
because
are
they've
kind of
never seen
possible.
one. Yes.
Yeah.
Because I remember
And
I remember when I was at St. John's looking at the bestiaries that were in the library, and
mm,
there was an early 13th century version with illuminations, and then there was a 14th century one of the same text, but the illuminations were totally different in terms of how they envisioned those animals, because somebody obviously had a different frame of reference and might have actually seen some of those animals in the 100 years of the production of those texts, or just simply the fact that the person doing this manuscript had never seen an elephant, but the person doing the illuminations on the other one knew a guy who saw one, possibly.
yeah, and you can just imagine, I think because the first elephant that we know of to come to Britain was one that was given to Henry III, and it lived not very long in the Tower of London. And cost quite a sum of money. It was a present from his brother-in-law, King Louis of France. And it cost quite a, we can find out how much it cost to transport it to the Tower of London. And Matthew Paris, the chronicler, drew a fantastic picture of the elephant. And when you see that, you go, yeah, that actually looks like an elephant. And it's got the kind of bulk, it's got the tusks, its eyes are kind of a bit too far up its skull because it's a kind of side-on view of the elephant. But nevertheless, it's very recognizably elephantine. And you do get a sense that Matthew Paris's drawing was preserved, but people after that, now they knew properly what an elephant looked like.
Right.
And that's it, it became a kind of meme, if you like, that spread through illustrations at that point. And eventually, as you were saying, by the later bestiaries, people go, yeah, I know what an
Seen
elephant
it.
looks like.
Because Matthew Paris saw it and he drew a picture, and I've seen his picture or variation of it. And
Yeah, and I've seen other bestiaries drawn by people who've maybe studied in the Mediterranean and they've seen an elephant. And now we can put together this kind of vision of what an elephant looks like.
well, and that's one of the things that's interesting to talk about Norse culture or even just medieval European culture in general is a lot of people assume erroneously that medieval people didn't go anywhere, that there was no real
Mm.
movement, or as I like to explain to my students when we talk about Viking, Vikinga means Bay Raider. It's a part-time summer job, not an ethnicity. Not all Vikings were Scandinavian and not all Scandinavians were Vikings. But they went everywhere and they went through the Mediterranean. They were in Constantinople, they went down the Volga. So can you talk a bit more, kind of as an introduction, into our Norse culture, mythology, and what we do and don't know, and what is complete speculation and what is just misconception?
Well, that's it. That's a huge ask,
I
isn't
know.
it?
I
And one of
dropped
the
that on
things
you.
that I think is very interesting is, and I have no real answer for this, is why people are so interested in Vikings. Particularly, I guess, in North America, partly because of the myth of Vinland, I suppose, and the idea that Scandinavians came to some part of North America, most likely Newfoundland, as part of the kind of colonial journey across westwards across the North Atlantic. And people are interested in the British Isles because we have Viking or Scandinavian DNA in our bloodlines. And people are interested in northern France and northern Germany and so on. And I think the further you get away from the North Sea, perhaps the less interested you are. But even so, even if it's not a question of ancestry, people are still really fascinated by this idea of these people getting in these boats. And even when you go and see the Viking longships that have been preserved in Oslo or in Roskilde, you look at them and you think, I would not like to cross the North Atlantic in that with a bunch of sheep and some cows in order to go and
Horses, maybe.
Iceland and horses. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I'm going to take them to Iceland, about which I know very little. I'm going to settle there for the rest of my life. I mean, what were they thinking? What was driving them to leave Scandinavia? And there are questions like population pressure. Was the population expanding after some of the difficult years in the 6th century when you had famine and the effect of volcanic eruptions elsewhere in the world causing kind of real climate hardship in Scandinavia, it seems, at that point? Or was it simply shipbuilding technology improved such that you had, if you didn't get shipwrecked and you had a decent wind, you had a good fighting chance of getting somewhere where you can make your fortune? And the sense too, as you were saying, it's a part-time summer job. And if you live long enough and you get a decent share of treasure from the lord who's been leading your ship, then you can go and buy a farm and settle down and have a family and bore people to death with your Viking adventures, no doubt. But you kind of get a sense that there are old Vikings sitting on, at least in popular culture. There's one old Viking who's been here 30 years ago, and he knows the way to get round the rocks and into the harbour to sack the monastery, or he knows the lady of the local castle and whether will she give us some hospitality or not. But if you
He
didn't
knows the
die
lady of the
young,
castle is he knows the lady of the castle.
yeah, well, we do have some wonderful stuff about Ermengarde of Narbonne, who was, of course, a historical figure from the 11th century, and Harold Hardrada, who was sailing around the Mediterranean, stopping by to see her,
As you do.
and fluttering his eyelashes, I think, at her. And she must have wondered what on earth this was that had washed up on her shore, I think, particularly since we have some of the poems he composed to celebrate her. And you do kind of wonder, did he think maybe I have a future here in Narbonne with this lovely lady, or was this just one more kind of adventure he could talk about when he went home and eventually became King of Norway? Was it just one more thing to tell the grandchildren about? That sort of sense of Viking inquisitiveness and expansiveness and going places just to find out what they were like, I think is something that if we just think of them as jumping into ships, tearing off to somewhere on the other side of the ocean, whacking people with axes, stealing all the treasure they can lay hands on, and heading off again. That's in a way, it's the kind of gaming version of, or early gaming version, because Viking games have got much more subtle and well informed now, I think. But the sense that people that Scandinavians would come to the country, scout it out a bit, come over in force, bring some women, stay over the winter, start a local cheese making industry. This is one of the things I always find fascinating about cheese culture in Spain, apparently, was brought by Vikings.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
So I was told by a well-informed historian that they had sheep, obviously, and goats, and they drank milk, but they hadn't really thought about cheese. And when the Viking raiding parties were overwintering, the one thing that they wanted, along with nice hunks of meat, was cheese because
Why
everybody
not? Cheese
who
is
doesn't like
amazing.
cheese. And so they would get the milk from the goats or the sheep and trade for them. They weren't stealing it or anything, just trade various bits and pieces. And then the women, who were always kind of invisible in this story, but who had gone along as wives, as mistresses, as people who were going to do some of the cooking, as the people who were going to repair the clothes, who were going to do the washing, and who were probably going to give sensible advice about what to do next time. Should you go this way? Should you go that way? Made the cheese and traded the cheese back to the Spaniards, as well as eating it themselves, of course. And this is supposed to be the origin of the Spanish cheese industry.
Wow.
Uh, Sounds a little bit like a kind of made up story, but yeah, who knows?
I mean, it's possible, and this is the thing about so many of these. Unless we have direct evidence that says no, 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 anything's possible to an extent. Since we know that there were Scandinavian explorers and raiders and just travelers in the Mediterranean. I mean, they went through the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily and North Africa and Constantinople. I mean, there's evidence. I've seen some of the artifacts of coins with Arabic that were made into necklaces that were found in Viking
Mm.
burials. So we know that that contact exists. So why not cheese?
Yeah, yeah, why not cheese? So the cheese in a sense is it's not going to leave a lasting trace. What you need is some local monastic chronicler to say, and this winter we had loads of cheese because the Vikings were camped on the other side of the river. And I don't think we have anything quite as solid as that. But yeah, this sense of kind of give and take, as well as taking and taking and
Right.
sailing off Scandinavia with it, is quite important, I think. And I guess, 50 years or so ago was the beginning of the kind of revisionist view of the Vikings when scholars were so keen to get over the idea of guys in horned helmets. Obviously, we know they didn't have horned helmets, just doing these hit and run raids all the
Right.
time.
The
So
rape, pillage,
kind
and
of,
burn. Yeah.
yeah, and go home again. And they kind of toppled over a little bit into actually these are really sensitive people who liked, as they were rowing across the Atlantic, liked to compose poetry, and they they liked their fashions. We're always being told that Vikings really washed a lot. Um, the, that the Anglo-Saxons kind of looked at the more successful Danes in the 10th century and went, why the Danes pulling the women in
Because they
this
don't
way?
stink.
They wash, and they have quite cool haircuts.
Right.
And you have monks saying you don't want to be like the Danes guys, and you have a sense that probably the Danes are going, well, I feel like that, but
That's
the
fine.
lovely ladies have a rather different view of us.
Well,
So
yeah.
yeah, and the last exhibition on Vikings, what, 12 years ago now, the British Museum was very keen on the idea of Viking bling. Obviously, because they had lots of jewelry, lots of gold neck rings, all the kinds of splendid things you're
Right.
wearing. I've
Catches the
taken
eye.
mine, I've taken mine off so it doesn't make a noise on the microphone. And so it made the Vikings look kind of a little bit like sort of driven by fashion. Where can they get some really quality jewelry to show off in? And so all of these things, I think, are now coming together to give us a much richer and more complex picture of what that Scandinavian culture might have been like. And also, of course, thinking mostly of those, as you said, those younger men, the
Right.
ones who are going out and about. And what we haven't got such a good picture of is, but evidence is coming to light all the time through archaeology, is what it was like living at home.
Right.
Who was who was keeping the home fires burning in your Norwegian farm
Or
while
in
you're
Iceland. Yeah.
or in Iceland, yeah, while the boys had gone off raiding for the summer. Well, it was the woman, of course, and she was the one who was managing the servants, who was making sure that the sheep were grazed, that the sheep were being milked, that the cheese, this sounds a bit cheese obsessive, but
I'm
we
gonna
do
want
have
cheese
quite a
at the
lot
end of this.
about cheese
Yeah.
in sagas, and making sure the clothes were woven. And so I think one of the best books that's been written on this recently is Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir's book
Yeah.
Valkyrie,
Yeah.
which gives you a fantastic view from start to finish of what a Scandinavian woman's life would have been like.
And I,
And she found out so much that I had never really taken into account at all. But it's really the best place to start if you want to think about women in that period.
well, and also, I mean, the sagas, since they're preserved mostly in Iceland and a lot of them were written in Iceland, they do give us quite a lot of detailed information. Some of it's fictional, some of it's factual. I mean, I was in Iceland in 2014 and Jesse Byock took us out to his dig at Mosfell because he
Mm.
used Ale Saga, and for 20 years he was convinced that they would be able to find the settlement of Ale Skallagrimson, and they found it, and they found it exactly where they thought they would, and they went to the farm, and the farmers are like, what took you guys so long? We've always known. And so he'd been excavating it, and he took us out there. And the sagas are fiction. but also not fiction. And so they do give us a lot of day to day, but that's Iceland. In some cases, it's Orkney. In some cases, it's Ireland. In
Mm,
some cases, it's Norway. But I think one of the things that people really get fascinated with is the idea, the mythology of Vikings. And I'm reminded of Mel Gibson's statement in the 1990s where he was promising that he was going to make a Viking film. And it was after he'd done
mm.
Passion of the Christ and used Aramaic and
Uh-huh.
Latin and all right, fine, whatever. And he kept talking about doing a Viking movie and he was going to, and he's like, but these are going to be the vicious, bloodthirsty Vikings. These are going to be the Blood Eagle Vikings. And I'm like, I have a lot to say about the Blood Eagle in the sense that it's an amazing
Mm,
literary motif for which we have no archaeological evidence or support that it was ever done, and it's not in the law texts either. But that fed a lot of the kind of common interest. And then the series The Vikings came out on the History Channel. And then you have Bernard Cornwell's series that deals with the Last Kingdom that is set
mm.
in that pre-conquest, the Saxons and the Danes, and then of course all of that kind of they look very similar. I have the books, and I read one, but they all start to. I'm like, yeah, but I do research in this. The Viking
Hmm.
series and the Last Kingdom series started to run together, but then of course the Viking series, you end up with the same band of Vikings doing everything. Like
Yes,
these guys must
yeah.
have lived for a few hundred years. But do you think that that popular culture interest in the late 90s, early 2000s, and through the 2000s, especially with the History Channel, and I've been on the History Channel, I'm sure that you have as well, where you're like History Channel version of the
Mm.
Vikings. Do you think that's just part sparked the popular interest and rekindled it? Or is that something that's always kind of latently been there and people are just intrigued by the idea of Vikings?
I think it's some sort of interest in Vikings has been around for about 200 years, I think, and you can chart it as I kind of did in the Norse myths that shape the way we think.
Wagner.
But I think it's probably right to say that this millennium, those two shows in particular, Last Kingdom and Vikings, really they because they looked like they were based on history because part of their selling point was maybe not so much the Last Kingdom, but you had characters like Alfred the Great, who
Yeah,
everybody learned about in school and go, well, he's real at least,
right.
even if Uhtred isn't real. Um, and it was there's quite a lot of attention to detail in those shows.
The material culture
And
in Vikings is really good, especially the first
yeah,
two or three seasons. The material culture is really good.
yeah, and because they had experts consulting on it, people like Neil Price and Elizabeth Ashman Rowe and so on. And so although I think there were probably points where they said, you know what, if this is made of styrofoam, that probably doesn't matter. Yeah, we'll cut a few corners here. But I think that gave people a real visual imaginary of the Vikings to work with. And it's tapped into this new kind of medievalism, if you like, which is concerned with authenticity. And authenticity is not quite the same as accuracy, though it's quite easy to conflate the two of them. Because in some ways, accuracy is a chimera. How are we going to know what's accurate?
Right.
And it's one of the points that Neil Price, the archaeologist, often makes that if you had a real life Viking coming to watch some Viking movies, he would go, "Why are all these characters dressed as dead people?" Because of course, the our idea of what people would be wearing, what kind of jewelry they have, is based on what they have in their graves,
I
and
hadn't even
probably
thought about that. Oh, wow.
it's a fantastic point. Neil is so good at kind of pinpointing these disconnects between
Yeah.
a historical possibility and the way that people think about things. And so the authentic is not so much the historical accurate as what people think is historically accurate. And so it's a kind of popular medievalism at a level where people go, I mean, it's not quite here we are in the 10th century, but wait, isn't there the steam train in the background?
Right.
It's nobody does that kind of thing. Um, but it's also, as Neil Price also makes this point, that just because somebody is waving around a sword hilt that's the wrong kind of style for that particular period, we shouldn't start picking holes in it. If it
Right.
looks good enough if it looks enough like a Viking sword hilt, then we can let it go. We don't have to go, wait a minute, actually that style hadn't been, was going to be invented in 100 years' time.
Right. I think the
Um,
bigger issue comes with the this set of Vikings sacked Paris, as well as having, Lindisfarne in 793, as well as having the same group of Vikings do all of the
oh
things.
yes, and look, here they are off to Iceland, settled 100 years after the sack of Paris, but they're still going. Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, but that's a kind of storytelling shortcut, isn't
Right.
it?
Yeah, it is.
And what you could do is have them all die of old age and go, oh, but look, here, their sons, a happy band of cousins who are all doing this stuff.
Well, you do get a
Uh,
bit of that, and I think I may have given up on Vikings probably the last season. And I mean they do the sack of York and everything because I thought Vikings was really well done to a point. And of course
mm,
when they do have they have Ragnar Lothbrok thrown into the pit of snakes, which happens in the saga.
yeah.
I'd like to know where they got all those snakes that are venomous in England, but I mean
Mhm.
that's a problem with the saga. That's not a problem with the because they are actually following the saga. Um, and I just kind of lost track at a certain point, and I tapped in a bit with the sack of Paris, and I went, oh, all right. Now you're just
Yeah.
it was this kind of thing is it started really well, and again, there's some things where I don't expect either authenticity or accuracy, but I loved the authenticity of that early series. But do you think the
Mm.
fact that it was on the History Channel gave people the impression that all of it was also accurate as well as authentic?
Yeah, I think it did kind of. I mean, I think s- the smarter viewer or the more probing viewer is going to say, well, wait a minute, how did they know about all of this? You know, what's the evidence? But then you have got both the kind of fan culture, you've got the newspaper or online commentariat saying things like, well, actually, Viking, there is some evidence of Viking tattoos. Not much, and possibly not anything like as much as all of these people in the show, but of course it did help to distinguish Vikings from the
So
Anglo-Saxons.
you know who's
And
who.
then you get this Viking haircut now that
Right.
all Vikings now have, with this kind of buzz cut at the sides and inlaid teeth, which is hardly worth doing unless you've got characters grinning like idiots all the way through to show their inlays. But that's something that turns up in Rob Eggers' The Northman, that his
Right.
Valkyrie has got inlaid teeth because Neil Price told him that there were
Sure.
some skulls have been found with inlaid teeth. Not, I think, of women particularly, but no. So this kind of authenticity takes on a life of its own.
Right.
And it's when you're marketing a film, I've done some work on the marketing of The Northman, and Rob Eggers was very much, this is the most authentic movie we could have made. And
Right.
that got glossed by the New York Times as, is this the most accurate Viking movie ever made? And kind of, well, accurate, huh? And Rob Eggers is somebody who also said that in the first instance, he and Sion, the co-writer of the film, had thought about making it in Old Norse. And instead of everybody having a vaguely Scandinavian accent, um, which I think made hearing the dialogue a little bit harder than it needed to have been in some places. But I think the studio said, actually, no, Rob, no.
No. No.
But
You
then
would have
his
you would have had a bunch of Icelanders going, now hang on a minute, because the language is still so close in Iceland and
Yeah,
in
are
Norse.
they speaking modern Icelandic, or do you have to have reconstructed 10th century Old Norse?
But all of this to goes to say, though, is that there seems to be cycles of medievalism in terms of what literary sources, what traditions kind of get produced. We haven't had a King Arthur anything in years that I remember, except for
No.
television series. But we haven't had King Arthur films since really the 90s and early 2000s. And maybe missing something more recent. It's possible.
There's that Guy Ritchie one, which was probably called King Arthur. I think it was about 2017, with
Okay.
Charlie Hunnam as Arthur.
I
And
may have missed that one.
it was not great. But it
Okay.
did have some Vikings in it, actually, rather encouragingly. When Arthur is finally crowned after a lot of argy-bargy, um, and all the peoples, and this is maybe out of Geoffrey of Monmouth, I don't know, all of the peoples are coming to the coronation feast to pay him tribute. And one of the actors from Vikings, I forget which one, the kind of main Viking-y Viking, showed up with some of his Viking pals, all with the haircuts. And kind of went, oh, hello, Arthur. We are also saluting you, you know. And I was thrilled by the appearance of random Vikings at the Arthurian court.
I mean, I think I think the only good part of the 2004 King Arthur film with Stellan Skarsgård as
Mm.
the Hengist and Horsa, the Saxons. I'm like, okay, that's spot on. The rest of it, I don't know what the fuck that was. In fact, when I met Owen Griffith, I met Owen Griffith at Dragon Con, and
Hmm.
lovely, lovely man. I got a selfie with him, and I did say, why did you do that? I mean, King Arthur. And he was like, I needed the money.
Yeah, why does any actor do this? But
I mean,
yeah, I
that's,
mean, where is the
Braveheart in a
big
bikini with
Arthurian
that. So,
movie? That's a question that Arthurians, and because the International Arthurian Congress is coming next year, and because Ad Putter and I are going to be curating an exhibition on King Arthur in the Western Library in Oxford in 2028. But Ad and I have now got to write the book that goes with this exhibition. And in fact, I've just done a sample chapter on Arthurian women. So I've been thinking about Arthurian women and thinking about enchantresses again for that. And one of the questions, I think one of the, if we are finding ways to engage the audience with some feedback, would be, I think an interesting question would be, what would the ideal Arthurian film look like?
right. I mean,
Has
that's a
there
good
been a great
question.
Arthurian film?
Can you answer that question? Do you have an answer
Well,
to that question?
I mean, for my money, the best one ever is Robert Bresson's Lancelot du Lac, which I think is terrific. But it's just the last couple of weeks, really, of the Arthurian story.
Right.
And so all you have is the build up to the final battle. You have Mordred, you have Arthur, you have these tensions between the two groups of knights. They're all in the forest, kind of circling around each other. And it's beautifully realized, but it's only part of the whole thing.
Right.
But then, if you, other people might say Excalibur is the best attempt, but the tone of Excalibur is so uncertain. And Boorman plays around with the timeline so much that every time I rewatch Excalibur, which I did a lot with my students, you would get to the point where Arthur discovers Lancelot and Guinevere together. You've really had quite a lot of action at this point, and he becomes debilitated. She goes off and becomes a nun. Lancelot goes mad and runs off into the forest. And you think, okay, well, that's about it then. Oh no, we have the whole quest for the Holy Grail. We got another hour of this, and then endless kind of trailing around of Parzival and so on. And then when you get back on track, once you've got Mordred and Morgan Le Fay back on the scene, and you've the wasteland has been restored, and now you've got the final showdown, then it picks up again. But if you
Right.
because Borman was so interested in the idea that the land and the king are one, and that
Fisher
um,
King, the yes.
it's the Fisher King, it's the wasteland, it's way too much Jesse Weston has got into his mind at that point. That's why the whole thing is 2.5 hours long.
But that actually brings me to part of what you talked about in Arthurian Enchantresses, because Morgan Le Fay and the figure of Morgana in that film, I mean, and Helen Mirren is amazing. We all love Helen Mirren.
Mm,
But of course, what Borman really gets wrapped up in it, and to my mind, that is not only the most uncomfortable sex scene in cinematic history, full 15th century plate armor, the fact that
ow.
well, also the actress who plays Igraine was his daughter, is Borman's daughter.
Yeah.
And he made her do that scene with both Colin Redgrave and Gabriel Byrne over and over and over again.
And there's that weird dance thing that she does with the kind of
Yeah.
hair. Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
There's some quite sleazy 80s stuff going on in that
Yeah,
film.
the 1981, this is what we think that dark ages look like. But even with Morgana and the breastplate and
Mm,
the way that they've dressed her, it is fascinating, and of course very much a product, I guess, of 1970s neo-pagan fantasy Renfest. It's a little Renfest, that's fair.
mm,
I'm a huge Renaissance fair fan. I am, and I know it when I see it. But do you think that the way that modern popular culture envisions women in these stories, like Morgan Le Fay, in that story, it's Morgana. They don't call her Morgan Le Fay. We just know who that's meant to
mm,
be. But as you point out, in the earlier texts, Morgan Le Fay is not Arthur's sister, even in the earlier versions. And that incest aspect doesn't even come in until Mallory. Mallory does include it, but it's not in most of the Arthurian tradition. So do you think that the popular culture latches on to that last iteration and the most sensational and runs with it? And what happens to the female characters in that case?
yeah, well, I think what it really happened in the 19th century, I think, was the because you have it in Mallory, but you got it in Mallory's French sources as well. And I think if really we have to go back to the introduction of Lancelot into
Gretchen de Troyes.
into the story, because once you have Lancelot as Guinevere's love interest and the whole adultery subplot, then Guinevere can't also fall in love with Mordred when he
Right.
plots to take over the throne, as she did in the earlier versions.
So I think in Geoffrey of
So
Monmouth, isn't it Geoffrey of Monmouth? She's like, no. And then Wasp, she's like, hmm. And then by Laman, she's like, yes. Is that even
yeah,
that
the
evolved in the
alliterative
12th
mort,
century?
she's completely up for it. Um, yeah, so you can see how her character changes. And so Mordred's got to have something else about him that makes him more interesting. And I think that's when the incest storyline is probably borrowed from the stories of Charlemagne, in fact, who commits incest with his sister, and the offspring of that is the traitor Ganelon, who is also working to try and undermine the kingdom. So Mordred is because he's the younger brother of Sir Gawain, who is the son of the King of
Right.
Orkney,
Yes.
and their mother is a whole different Arthurian sister,
That's
Morgause.
Morgause. Yeah.
Yeah,
Morgause or Morgause. Yeah.
Morgause, yeah, who's the original sister who's called Anna in Geoffrey of Monmouth and was married to Lot of Orkney and had a whole bunch of sons which were not incestuous or anything like that. And so it's by the 19th century that Morgause and Morgan have just got too similar, and people decide to smush them together so that you don't have to worry too much about two figures with very similar names.
Because
And you don't
Morgause
have
in the medieval text, Morgause commits adultery as well, and her sons kill her. Isn't it? Is it Agravain who kills her in bed, or I've
yeah,
forgotten? It's
yeah, that's
Agravain
right.
who
It's
kills her.
Agravain,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, she's a widow at this point, to be fair. So, she's got an interesting um, a post-married sex life, if you like. But perhaps the young lover that she picks on shouldn't be the son of the man who killed her husband, which is kind of who seems to be a very nice knight. I always think Lamorak is dealt a really tough hand, and he does seem to go for the older lady, as it were. Um, but perhaps it wasn't it was partly kind of horror at their mother having an affair, but also that she should be sleeping with the son of the guy who killed her husband in the first place that sort of triggers that.
Well, and
So for the
Agravain
Victorians, she
has,
becomes too complicated
yeah,
and the
Agravain
whole thing
has
is too
anger
sordid.
issues anyway. I mean, Agravain is kind of part of the problem with the treason and adultery with Lancelot and Guinevere. I mean, he's the one who's outside the door going, "We know you guys are having sex," and he's the one who gets killed by Lancelot in the stanzaic, and I think that's in the French. That's the Mort Arthur as well. But
Yeah.
Agravain has anger issues anyway, and seems to really want to take them out on women. That seems to be a general sense of Agravain in a lot of those texts.
Yeah, I think aggravating and aggravating is it's
Yes.
kind of fine, doesn't it? And he is sort of aggravated by all kinds of things. But by the time you get to the 19th century, Morgan has, it's just simpler to make her the mother of Mordred. And so then you have the two of them in this kind of dyad plotting against Arthur. Usually, as far as Mordred is concerned, yeah, he has power. He's power hungry. Morgan, because the Victorian versions try and downplay the incest a bit, because clearly nobody wants to suggest that Arthur, who is after all the hero of Tennyson's Idylls of the King, who is very much a poem that's dedicated to Queen Victoria and to Prince Albert.
Right.
Nobody wants to suggest that Arthur was committing adultery with anybody, let alone his sister. So then Mordred's incestuous origins, he's just back to being a kind of standard nephew there in the Idylls of the King. And later Victorian treatments kind of fudge where he comes from, but he's just got a bad mother and he's a bad son and a bad nephew. And who his father is then becomes a bit indistinct. And that carries on to some extent in the 20th century. Poor old Morgause gets sort of written out, except in Mary Stuart.
Yes. And actually
And
that was my formative introduction to Arthuriana was Mary Stuart.
mm,
I was 12 and I read all four of those books over and over again and was
they were
always
terrific, weren't they? I think
really
that was
amazing.
apart from some kind of King Arthur story for children, it was those books that really got me interested in all of those characters. But Morgan is coming back into her own now. I think ever since Mr. Babylon, whatever we think of that as a book, was kind of pioneering
Yeah.
in showing that Arthurian history doesn't, that there are gaps and absences in the Arthurian story that can be filled by women.
Yes. And
And that was sort of groundbreaking. And now we have any number of books being narrated by Arthurian heroines
well,
and giving their own particular points of view.
and I mean, I loved Miss of Avalon as a book as well because I was a teenager when I read it. And I think part of what that also does by giving Morgan that voice, but it's not just giving the voice to the standard Guinevere, because Guinevere is really
Mm,
very much her opposite in that, but also giving voice to the woman who does not adhere to the standard Christian narrative that people assume is the medieval voice. And I think
mm,
that's part of it. And but again, looking at your own work, you often look at those intersections of Christian and non-Christian as more symbiotic than replacement. And do you think that part of it is just understanding a different understanding of medieval history and culture now than they had 30, 40, 50 years ago when they're like, no, everything's Christian. Christianity replaced everything and pagan was always bad. Do you think that we've kind of revised the way we think because we have more information or just because our own sensibilities have changed?
I think I think we have revised the way we think, and I think that has to do with, in part, it's a rereading of sources. I don't think we have a huge amount more information than they had 40 years ago. Though you have more women scholars, you have more women archaeologists, you have more um, people across the Arthurian world looking at these kinds of questions and foregrounding what it might have been like to be in this particular female character situation. And you also have, as a result, I guess, of second wave feminism, a kind of resurfacing of these stories, and which Marion Zimmer Bradley was very much part of, I think, which fed into the kind of growing idea of the goddess, and as part of Wicca, as part of other New Age religions. And so that was a kind of zeitgeist thing that hasn't gone away. And and I think that also means that, and I think this probably has something to do with romantasy as the next thing, or in perhaps even the current thing in fantasy, that these stories which foreground women whose stories we kind of know,
Right.
but with some magic or with herbal healing powers or with some kind of second sight or prescience. So not with a whole bunch of dragons necessarily, but with a sense that women have different ways of knowing, of experiencing, of understanding, very much caters to that audience that's buying fantasy now, and that's women,
Right.
preeminently fed by romantasy. And from what I hear, the old kind of sword and sorcery, Conan the Barbarian style fantasy is not selling, and it's not being picked up in the same way,
Right. Well,
because the whole kind of book talk phenomenon is going for these more female, more woman-centered stories.
well, and in a way that's, I mean, you think about the Arthuriana of the 1990s, and even, the toxic masculinity in some of those films. First Night is cringy on so many levels.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
not also the costumes, it's very Battlestar Galactica, but again, the original 1978 Battlestar Galactica. But I think part of it is recognizing that this is a response to the toxic masculinity, or that masculinist perspective that comes out of the 90s, that is itself a response to second wave feminism. That's like, no,
Mm,
we're
mm,
going to be the manly men. We're going to be the men who, we know when a woman wants us, even if she says no. I'm looking at you, Richard Gere. And yet now, of course, it's a cycle where women are going, yeah, no, we don't like that. We're no, when we say no,
mm,
we actually mean it. That's not try harder. And so I think that's also why you see so many people interested in the shield maiden idea of Lagertha and the women who kick ass with the Vikings. But as you say, there were women who would journey with the Vikings, but did we actually have shield maidens?
that's a very good question, isn't it? Um, I don't know enough to say yes or no definitively. Um, they are a staple of the kind of fantasy of culture of the 13th, 14th centuries.
Yes.
The idea that it was something you might do before you got married. Just
Right.
pick up a sword, go fight with your brothers, crew a ship, conquer kingdoms, as Gudrun Gjukadottir says in some of the Eddic poetry. We've got that grave in Birka, BJ581, with the female skeleton with all the weapons, the horse, the gaming pieces. Who knows what that means? The dead don't bury themselves.
Right.
Somebody arranged that grave to communicate a message that we can't really understand.
Right.
As far as I know, with regard to that grave, it doesn't look like that woman did a lot of fighting. She hasn't got healed injuries of the
Right.
sort that you find in other in yeah, fighting men of a similar vintage.
Maybe she was just that good. Maybe she just was that good.
Maybe she, yeah, until whatever it was finished her off, which could have been measles for all we know.
Right.
Leszek Gardewa has written quite a lot on Viking women warriors, and he knows the archaeological evidence from Poland, which does seem to throw out more of these kind of anomalous graves.
Right.
So maybe there were fighting women, maybe there were strategist women. Um, and in fact, the medieval story or medieval history, when you look at it closely, does show women put in positions where they do have to pick up a sword because
Right.
the men their menfolk have gone to fight people over here, but actually the danger is coming over here.
Right.
And so, although they're not necessarily trained for it, you can get a sense of situations where knowing how to handle a sword, having to handle a sword, could be very useful. And I
Right.
suspect there was a certain amount of not professionalization here, but just a bit of kind of self-defense training, if you like, that noble women might very well
Been
have done
trained.
with their brothers, just so
Right.
that they knew what to do when the bad guy's coming up the stairs in the castle.
Well, I mean, thinking about Stephen's Matilda, the fact that when he's in prison, Matilda has to rally the army to try and free him during I mean, that's all the Matildas, because of course you've got Empress Maud, who's fighting
Hmm.
against Stephen with Robert of Gloucester, aiding her. Whether she actually fought a battle, probably not, but she was certainly part of the strategy for defending her claim to the throne.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
when Stephen is captured, his wife Matilda is the one who has to kind of lead the army, or at least rally the army to go get him out. So, I mean, that's in the 12th century. So you do have women, and of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine very famously going on Second Crusade. Not that that was a good
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, well, she saw the world.
She did.
No, it gave rise to a certain amount of gossip, but yeah, I there were women present on these battlefields, and again, probably they had bodyguards 10 thick around them, so they
Right.
weren't really in much danger. But yeah, maybe you just had to know how to handle yourself in an emergency if someone bursts into your tent in the middle of the night.
Right. But okay, so that now gives us a perfect opportunity to wrap this up so that you can have some food. Um, but the perfect opportunity to wrap this up. And a lot of your work does deal with what modern society can take away from medieval history, mythology, all of this. So, what do you think modern society can learn from understanding the Middle Ages better?
I think they can learn a couple of things. I think one of them is a kind of sense of difference. And that's one of the kind of big takeaways from Eggers the Northman for me was, for all of his kind of bragging about how accurate everything was and how they consulted all these people and so on. The ways in which, in particular, he portrays Viking Age religion, for which we have very little evidence, apart from more or less folkloric stuff made up in the sagas, I thought was really clever in terms of giving you a sense of another way of thinking about the world, a world where there are gods, where there are undead people, where a world that's kind of numinous in that way. And so I think there's something about being able to stretch your idea of what's possible and what's human and taking in a bit more than the kind of scientific, rational, can we find it online? If not, does it really exist kind of
Right.
question. I also think it's important for people to have the opportunity just to look at medieval things and to step back from their ideas of the medieval period as the Dark Ages and to look at the beautiful artifacts that have survived, to look at the beautiful buildings that have survived, to read the literature, to think about the poetry, and to get a sense of, yeah, they were very weird in some ways, but also they were fundamentally kind of like us, that they had bodies like our bodies, that they were born, they fell in love, they died, they love their dogs, they love their children, they
They
like to
washed.
dinner. Yeah, they wash. They like their bling if they could get their hands on it. They thought about clothing. They liked people to tell them stories. Um, they were very frightened of hell. They were kind of optimistic about heaven. They had structures in their lives that really contained the ways in which they could live, and which we wouldn't like at all, I don't think, if we were put back in that situation now. But I think it's that kind of inevitable push and pull between sameness and difference. They were like us and they were not like us. There are things we can learn from them. There are things about them that we should absolutely not learn from, that we should not think, oh, wouldn't it be great if that came back again?
Right.
Um, Various kinds of patriarchal control, for example, just
Right.
to one thing. But at the same time, there's something I think one of the points that has often been made about the medieval is that it's this alluring period, and that's why it keeps turning up in fantasy. Yeah, partly that's because Tolkien was a medievalist, and so
We like elves.
fantasy is medievalist because Tolkien. But at the same time, there's the point that we know quite a lot about the medieval. So we have that sense of the authentic medieval
Right.
when we see it. We actually don't know that much. And so there's lots of spaces that we can fill in with it, contemporary imaginings, with thinking about what those clothes might have looked like, what it might be like to walk in some of those shoes, what it would be like to have to ride that long a period to get anywhere, what it'd be like to walk through the streets when they're full of mud and chickens and all the usual things you see in those kind of gritty medieval movies. Um, so I think it's that known yet unknown quality about the medieval period which really draws people in, that you can project quite a lot onto it, but you can also pull a lot out of it as well. And I think it's that balance that really is at the heart of the fascination people still have for that period.
Well, and of course, there's that sense, as you said at the very beginning, about politics and Game of Thrones, and a lot of people want to kind of assume that the arc of progress is straight up, which of course it's not. It is a roller coaster in terms of
Mm.
we have a lot that we can look to the Middle Ages for what not to do. And also what they said, you know what, we did that and it didn't work, and we really shouldn't do that. So perhaps we should learn from that history. As you say,
Yes.
there is that sense of politics. We're not that far removed from a lot of medieval mindsets in our own prejudices, our own misogynies, and we often project those backwards. So how do you think we can best recognize that when we look back at medievalism and how we envision it, if that makes sense?
I think we have to just always be open-minded and questioning, that we have to say, in a way, who is telling this story? Who are they telling it for? What are they trying to do with it? And those are sometimes quite hard questions to answer. But if you ask them, at least you're leaving yourself open to a kind of more comprehensive and more thoughtful engagement with the past than simply sucking up whatever beliefs you find on some website that tells you medieval people did this or medieval people did that. It's maintaining a kind of open-hearted, critical awareness, I think, is what's really important.
Well, Carolyne Larrington, it has been an absolute joy and pleasure. And perhaps we'll have an opportunity to have a second episode where we talk about fairies and trolls and dragons in more detail. That would be wonderful. But this has been absolutely fantastic, and I could keep you here forever. But I know
But
that it's late.
it's growing dark around here. Yes, yeah.
So
Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you, Kat. It's been really, I love this opportunity to just have an interesting, free-ranging conversation about all the things that you and I are so interested in. So, yes, by all means, let's come back to the fairies and dragons and trolls.
absolutely. And I am Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.